Take a seat.
Hello, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be back here in this wonderful country of Singapore and back at this university. It's a very odd thing for me to be coming back into academic life, but I tell you, I found it incredibly stimulating. And I also believe passionately in this course for reasons that I'm now going to explain. It's also been a matter of surprise that I decided, along with everything else, to take up the notion of religion's interfaith as a major part of my afterlife, if you like, having left my job as Prime Minister. And as the Dean was just telling you, one of the things that I do is I spend obviously a lot of time out in the Middle East in my role for the Middle East peace process. And one of the great things you get to do if you are someone from the Christian faith is you visit the most extraordinary places that are very familiar to you from the Bible, but that you wouldn't otherwise get the chance to visit. And the other day I was actually, I was by Jericho. There was the Mount of Temptation. So I was taken up the Mount of Temptation. I think they take the political leaders there. And the guide who was taking me there, suddenly, at one point, he just stopped me. We'd be talking about all the problems of the region and so on, and he just said to me, "Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, why did they all have to come here?" Which I thought was rather an interesting expression of how many people see religion today, but also its enormous importance to people. So the reason why I think this subject of faith and globalization is of such fundamental significance to understanding the world is as follows. I mean, globalization is a fact. I mean, we may like it, we may not like it. Personally, I do like it, but it's a fact. And whether it's through the internet or travel or mass communication, as we see, even by that live collaboration across thousands of miles between Yale and the National University of Singapore that the Dean was just referring to. The fact is, globalization today is changing the world, changing the nature of what we do, changing the way we live, the way we work, the way we interact with each other. And the characteristic of globalization that most stands out is how fast-moving it is. In other words, if you look at today's world, the feature of it, the nature of it, is in change, and the characteristic is how fast that change happens. You can see that from the economic crisis that's unfolded over these past months. What has been interesting, and indeed profoundly troubling, has been the way that the lack of confidence in one part of the world economy has been transmitted right across the world with astonishing speed. This was brought home to me last September when the United States made the announcement about the failure of Lehman Brothers, the bank. And on the day that was announced, I was sitting in my London home and I was watching the local news. And it was the sort of popular news programme. And they were talking about Lehman Brothers and its failure. And I was just thinking, in remote corners of the north of England, suddenly a name no one had ever heard of is leading the news with an impact on their lives. Indeed, I was just, as I was going out of the door to get into my car to go to work, there was a guy who saw me there and stopped me and said, "Mr. Blair, you should know this. Who are these brothers anyway?" People had never heard of this thing. They kind of thought there's a gang of brothers out there and they were causing real trouble, and it's time they were stopped. But suddenly something, subprime mortgages, major names in banking that people would never have heard of, suddenly now they're making an impact on their lives. So the characteristic of globalization is that its fast-moving speed produces enormous change, and the consequence of all of it is that the world's pushed together. that is the thing about the world today. And you can see this in your own university. I can see it in Yale. The fact is, people now come from around the world to international institutions and go out from those institutions around the world. I think when my little boy, Leo, is old enough to go to university, which will be in about 10 years' time, probably he will contemplate almost as a matter of course that he will either, maybe not his first degree, but probably afterwards, he will think of spending some time abroad, and that's the way the world is. So the consequence of globalization is that we become interdependent, interconnected, we're pushed together. Now, actually, if you look at the current crises that we face in the world today, they illustrate it very neatly. If you look at the economic crisis, the decision-making forum that will take place in the next few days is in London at the G20. Now, that too is significant. 10 years ago, it would have been at G8. Today, it's at G20. One other consequence of the change in the world is that power is shifting east, and it's shifting east again with speed. And so it would be unthinkable today, as well as foolish, to have a world summit on the economy without China there, without India there, without Brazil and the other emerging and developing countries. If you think of the other big challenge that there is, the G20 deals with the economic crisis, but the other major challenge will be addressed at the end of this year in Copenhagen in Denmark about climate change and the environment, which again is a major, major question. It affects countries right round the world. But the singular feature of it is that nobody believes that that is a crisis that can be handled by one country alone. It's got to be handled cooperatively, together, globally, and it's got to be done in a way that involves not just the developed world, but the developing world. And then if you take the issue to do with security, whether it's Iraq or it's Afghanistan or it's Iran or Pakistan, and sometimes people say, well, let's concentrate on one area rather than the other area. Actually, for me now, spending a lot of time out in the Middle East and that wider region really has one issue going on all the time within it, which is an issue about modernization, which is an issue about the world of Islam. Do the moderate and modernizing elements succeed in getting to the point where Islam feels a sense of peaceful coexistence with the modern world, or are those reactionary and extreme elements going to take control? So, all over the world, if you identify the crucial challenges, they are challenges in some ways about globalization. They're challenges that undoubtedly require global solutions, but the single most important consequence is that they reflect a world that is being pushed together, and in which, incidentally, no longer is it the West, Europe and America that is dominant. Power today has to be shared. The purposes have to be shared. The alliances have to be forged across East and West. So this is the nature of the world we live in, and the interesting thing is that pushing together is not just economic or political, it's also social and cultural to an extent. I can never be back in Singapore without remembering the time in 2005 when we bid for the Olympics for 2012 for London, which the bid took place here in Singapore. And there were two interesting things about it. The first is that I don't think I've ever been engaged in such an intensive negotiation in all my time in politics. And I also recall I was having to see people very, very fast in my hotel room in Singapore. And they would kind of bring people in to see me who were members of the Olympic Committee. And I would just get handed a slip of paper before they came in the door. And unfortunately, halfway through the session, they started to get the bits of paper mixed up. So I remember getting a piece of paper which said, "You're about to meet the champion Czech javelin thrower." So this guy walks in. The first thing I notice is he's small. It strikes me as a bit odd. Right. His next question throws me completely when he says, "Well, actually, he's not so much interested in London in 2012, he's more interested in the quality of the ice. And I'm thinking, I really don't know anything about javelin throwing at all, because anyway, it turned out he was the Norwegian ice skating champion. But I remember most of all, when we were trying to do that bid, we had to decide how we were going to present London. And actually, some people said, well, London, it's this great centre of history and all these famous buildings and, Buckingham Palace and the Houses of Parliament and Downing Street and Whitehall and all this, St. Paul's Cathedral, And actually what we decided in the end was that the thing that stood out about London most in today's world was that it was a meeting place and a mixing place for people from all sorts of different races and backgrounds and faiths and so on. And so we actually decided to present London in a very modern way. And we ended up having a group of school children from one of the London schools who were from all different types of races and ethnic backgrounds and faiths and so on, who came and were part of the presentation. And the interesting thing about that, I think it was actually part of the reason we won, is that in a way what we were signalling was that in the modern world, as people are pushed together, then the question is, can actually those people from those different backgrounds and cultures get along together, live together, exist together peacefully, or are we destined, as some people have said, to have a clash of civilizations, disharmony, distrust, sectarianism, and even hatred? So, in all of this huge force of globalization is pushing people together, pushing them together, as I say, economically and politically, but also socially and culturally. Some people react against that. There can be an economic reaction, which is protectionism. There can be a nationalistic reaction, which is anti-immigration. And there can be a cultural reaction, which is people deciding that they will take their own faith, have that as their means of self-identity, but identifying themselves in a sense, their faith as opposed to the other faith. So that is the debate, if you like, that goes on economically, politically, culturally in the world. And my point is very simple. If we are to make globalization work, we need both global action to meet global challenges, but we also need a sense of global understanding. And that understanding has to include the world of faith. Sometimes people say, well, in the modern world, religion is a dying entity. Actually, that is not true. When we look around the world today, it may be true of certain parts of Europe and the West. It's not true of the world as a whole. 2 billion Christians, 1.5 billion Muslims, 1 billion Hindus, hundreds of millions of Buddhists and Sikhs and Jews and those of other religious faiths. In fact, the majority of people in the world will identify themselves in part on the basis of their faith. And here, out in Asia, this is particularly important. Recently, a few days back, I was in the Philippines. Almost 100 million people, strongly Catholic, majority Catholic. But then Indonesia, again, a country, one of the largest countries by population in the world, strongly Muslim. So when we look at the world today, to understand it, it is hard to do so unless you also understand the world of faith. And not just understand it so that we have some knowledge of it, but understand it so that within that understanding and through that understanding we can learn to live with each other peacefully. Where there is ignorance, there is fear. Where there is fear, there is often conflict. Alternatively, where there is understanding, there is more likely to be respect, and where there's respect, there's more likely to be peace. So this is, in my view, not a small issue, but a big issue.
Take a seat.